Yeah, again, so this session has been video streamed and recorded, so just every one of you should be aware of that. It is about this this upcoming law, the GDPR, which is a data protection law. I'm going to say more about this. And the question I want to answer together with you is how does MediaWiki relate to GDPR on a technical basis? So what do users need to know that use MediaWiki, that run MediaWiki on their sites? What's missing? How do we intend to remedy these things? And yeah, what's our position? Where do we stand regarding the GDPR? I'm Markus Glaser. I have a few hats on, or had. Currently I'm spokesperson of the MW Stake user group, which is a group that cares for MediaWiki installations out there in the wide internet world. On my professional life, I run an enterprise that helps companies set up their MediaWikis, and we publish a product called BlueSpice, which makes MediaWiki enterprise ready. So I also do have a professional interest in the outcome of what's happening here. Okay, so where do we stand? What's the GDPR? GDPR is short for General Data Protection Regulation, which is a EU law that will become effective on May 25th, 2018. There has been a transition period from the old country-based regulations to this EU-wide regulation. The transition period was for 2 years. So actually, all that panic that happens now with regards to the GDPR could have been avoided if we let all the people affected by the law would have started working towards implementing it earlier, but that's probably the human nature. So we see a lot of activity in Europe now in businesses trying to implement the requirements of this law. Actually, the intention of this law is good, and I fully support it. It's designed to help individuals to better control their personal data, the use of it, the processing of it, and be able to interfere if they feel like something happens with their personal data they don't want. As with many laws, the intention is good. Sometimes the details are not so perfect. So one of the flaws, I guess, we are seeing is that there is the words are very vague. So there's a lot of room for interpretation, and actually what is like a good way to implement the actual articles of the law is something eventually courts will have to decide. So there is no blueprint, no checklist you can just follow and say, okay, if you do this and that, then you fully comply. It's about the intention of protecting the data and helping them. But there is a lot of room for interpretation. As I know that not all of you are from the EU, you might be wondering if this law, how it does affect you. So the law is designed in a way that any interaction with any citizen from the EU, if you have any interaction, then this law applies. So if you come from outside the EU, I had found a very interesting hack, which is the EU blocker. So you set up your website, you put up an EU blocker, and any IP address from the EU would not be able to reach your website, which is a good idea. But then you have to see what happens if your EU citizen is in the US and tries to access your site. It still applies. So this law is rather creeping all across the web, and you should be. And in one page on MediaWiki, someone said, I'm not from the EU, I'm not affected. And another person answered, if you ever plan to set your foot on the EU and you don't want to get arrested or fined, you better see that you comply to that law. This is, I don't want to say if it's good or bad. That's just the current reading of this law. I forgot to say I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know this law by heart. I'm almost in the same situation as most of you are, so I see this law, I have to deal with it, and the question is, how can we do this? So a few basic terms. The law is about protecting personal data, and this is taken directly from the law. So the question is, what is personal data? It means basically any information that can be related to an individual person, a natural person. So personal data is not if I can identify an organization by it, because an organization is not a person by definition. Interestingly, it's also about the question directly or indirectly. So if, say, for example, I put my name somewhere, then I can be directly identified. If I put my IP address somewhere, that is probably a case of indirect identification, because it's possible to use the IP address, go to my provider, and get to my name. So that also applies to pseudonyms and other things. And then it's also a question of data processing. So if, for example, you write about a person that is from Germany, it's probably not totally identifiable here in this room. If you write about another person that is age 40 to 45, and then you somehow can bring those two data sets together, then you pretty much get me, or maybe another person here. But you can pretty much identify us, or me. So that is the combination of factors which should also be considered. The law applies to data processing, so that basically means any case when you handle, see, modify, delete, whatever data, that is processing. So it's a very wide term, and when in doubt if it's processing or not, you better assume it is processing under this law. As a rule of thumb, if you deal with any personal data, somehow you will be affected by this law. Okay, so this law is a huge number of articles, and there's a lot of principles involved and a lot of rights. The things that are of interest here are the ones that affect the technology. That's what I think we should be talking about. So it's not about, I don't know, the disclaimer you need to put on your page or things like that. And we have 6 rights. So actually when you try to categorize, to organize what's happening here, for the sake of technology, it's not that easy. So when you skim through the web pages, they give you a lot of advice. I tried to compile it a little bit, condense it, but again, I'm not guaranteeing completeness here. It's just the way I understand it. Okay, so what are the rights or the principles? There's one principle called transparency. So the user needs to know what's happening with their data, and they need to be able to access that data. So that is here, right to access and to be informed. There are a few requirements. For example, the user can ask an organization, what do you store about me? And the organization then has to give the user a list of the data they stored about this person. Okay, then you have the right to rectification. So if there is any false information somewhere stored, then the processing entity, that's the term, is obliged to correct this error and do so without fee. That's another thing. So for companies, so Facebook can't just go there and say, I charge you $10 for every spelling mistake in your name. I have somewhere in my data, they have to do it for free. Then there's the right to be forgotten. So if you want to go away from a website, from an organization, you can require that organization to completely forget about you. That is something we will probably have to talk about in the context of MediaWiki. Then there's the right to data portability, which is sounds somewhat strange in the first place. So basically, the data processor is required to provide a set of data in a form that can be imported or can be used elsewhere in a commonly known format to the user on request. So I can go to Facebook again. I can say, give me all the data you have about me, and then I get this large file or whatever printout, and I can do whatever I want with this file. So the question is, what's the purpose of this? In the context of Facebook, for example, if people, I see some people doing their photo journals on Facebook, and the lawmakers want to prevent a situation where Facebook says, okay, you can go away, we can erase all your data, but you can't take your personal photos with you. They're just locked in the system, so either you stay or you lose your data. So this prevention of lock-in is one of the main intentions behind data portability. And they also think competition among like similar platforms will increase there. I don't think we have a huge problem with data portability. I mean, there might be the question of how do we compile all the contributions of a user, but generally all the data, all the contributions a user makes to a MediaWiki is basically open, and so I don't see a big deal here. Okay, so then there's the right to restrict or object processing of data. Yeah, which is basically and you can withdraw your consent. So if I say it's okay for Wikipedia to process my data, to store my username, at a certain point I can say, okay, it's no longer okay, and then the username has to be removed. And the last thing is users need to be notified about security breaches. So if there is a large hack and a lot of data gets stolen, then all the affected users have to be notified. I guess that makes sense in a way. We still have to see how this can be achieved using MediaWiki. Okay, so I looked a little bit to other software I work with and tried to see what they do. So I found some position papers, and I guess you can find lots more if you look on the internet. So for example, OSM takes the articles of the GDPR and says, okay, with regard to this article, this is how we stand, this is the current situation, this is what we want to do. A more lightweight approach is came by Easy Redmine, so where the OSM paper has some 24 pages, I think Easy Redmine paper could be condensed on 2 pages or 3. So the second approach is to write plugins to make it easier for auditors, for example, and to provide the necessary export features. So WordPress, for example, does have a GDPR plugin, Joomla does have a GDPR plugin, and it might be worth looking into what features they provide using these plugins to see what kind of things we might think are missing in MediaWiki. And then, of course, there's the approach of adopting the core software again. Easy Redmine, which is software I use personally, does this. They added a few buttons to provide complete audit trails and things like that to ensure data integrity. Okay, so that's the general overview about GDPR so far as I can give it to you. I was like a little bit I was thinking a little bit about what data is affected in MediaWiki. And of course, again, this is not a complete list. This is the beginning of a brainstorming, which I want to continue with you in the Etherpad after I talked. So what kind of data do we have in MediaWiki? What kind of personal data? I think these here are pretty obvious. We collect username, real name, email address, and language. We do so by consent, save for the username, I think. So no one has to give their email address, but if they do, it's still storing personal data. And we still need to see how we can, for example, remove that. Also, we store IP address of anonymous users. That is probably more of an issue in open wikis out in the internet. It's not so much an issue in the internal wikis, because they typically do have something like single sign-on or a login-only policy. But still, the software is capable of storing IP addresses and uses that. And that's probably one of the questions that will keep us busy, how to deal with the IP addresses. Then we do have user actions, like the version history and action log. And while these are mostly about content the user contributes, there are some kinds of personal data which are interesting. So, for example, there's a timestamp. And you can do like you can do profiling using a timestamp. So you typically know when a user is active. You can, for example, interfere their time zone or their working hours or their non-working hours, or whether they edit in their working hours. You see there's a lot of stuff in there. So timestamps in the logs. Also, if you have a profile of what kind of articles a user edits, you can maybe profile the user's interests. You can draw various conclusions from that, which is also this combination of things, combination of data and identification. And I think we can also deal with that quite easily, hopefully, but then we do have one thing in MediaWiki which is quite tricky, that is all kind of data that is in the content area. So starting with signatures, which are part of the content, links to user pages, any contribution of a user where the name is mentioned or that can be personally attributed, could potentially be a personal data. And yeah, we have to find a reasonable way to deal with that. So while it is quite easy to do a replace of signatures in the current version, it might not be so easy to remove the signature from like all the previous versions. I mean, it can somehow be done probably, but even if you find the perfect regex to remove a signature, there's always the risk of false positives and things like that. So that is one of the things where we need to see how we deal with it. Okay, so where do we stand? This is again the beginning of drafting a document. So the right to access and to be informed about the data, we do have a list of recent changes, we do have a list of user contributions, we do have the logs that can be filtered. So the user pretty much knows most of what is stored about the person. They can also do a full text search for their username and see where they are mentioned, at least in the current revision. So then we have the right to rectification. In the data, the user can just change it, and as far as I know, there is no history of data in the user table. And in the most current version of an article, you can also correct the data. And I think one could safely argue that if it is in the most current, if it's fixed in the current version, that would somehow suffice, at least rectification I'm not sure about erasure. So that's the right to be forgotten. I think we have to put some effort, some energy into that. Regarding the data portability, there's the export pages, and while I still think we should provide easier user interfaces for exporting the data for one person, theoretically the person is able to export the pages they contributed, so we don't have a lock-in situation, and I think with the page export this should be okay. Again, not a lawyer. Right to restrict or object data processing, I'm not really sure if that is a technical thing. It might just be that we need a opt-out page on MediaWiki saying I no longer consent. Sorry.
For the right to restrict, it's okay. I want to. It's the user saying I will have a legal action over this data. Please do not move that. So the solution is to just clone this data into another base and move the data on another instance of MediaWiki. Don't touch this data there.
Okay. Should be okay. Okay. So even if but I have to remove the data of the user in the future version.
Just need to add it somewhere so that it can be used in a legal process and not on the normal page.
Sounds cool. And last thing, breach notification. There is no mass mailing feature in MediaWiki right now. But again, there is no requirement for a technical solution. But if you run a wiki with more than a few hundred users, then extracting all the email addresses and sending a mail one by one to those users might be a little bit hard. So maybe this could be a good point to provision MediaWiki with a kind of a notify all users about something feature.
A few people have also proposed that central notice might be adequate to meet that requirement. It's just a suggestion.
Yeah, I would like from the text, from how I read the text. I think it would be okay because it's notification. The question is, does it require a push notification, for example? And that's something that's probably up to lawyers to decide in the end. But I mean, if we decide, I mean, I don't know if we are not a decisive body here, but if the MediaWiki community decides to do a minimal approach, I guess that a notification on the site could also be okay.
Just one additional set of thought we'll have thought about them as a check user at a website data about type projects or larger projects. But that's something that that is not public, and we generally don't want to disclose to them. So there's a bit of a conflict in what they want and what we want, and how we would resolve that.
So I take an easy approach here because I say this is about MediaWiki and not about the Wikipedias. But I know there is a discussion about that, and that's probably a very tricky part. Even though people can only request data stored about themselves and not about others, but the question is, how can you do this in a safe manner? Yeah, so that's the end of me talking. And what I would like to do is, I have basically copied all of this over to an Etherpad, and I think we can go through it and see if we have any additions right now, if we can find some potential solutions, and then what I would love to see, like in a few weeks maybe, is a page on MediaWiki saying GDPR compliance, and then we address just the articles and say this is how we comply, or how we intend to comply. There is one thing that might be useful information. When I was talking to, I have to get my company ready to GDPR as well, and I talked to a lot of people knowledgeable of GDPR, and most of them say it, if you are like in danger of being fined or being subject to a lawsuit, and you can prove that you actually started the process of implementing the regulations, that helps a lot. So at least for organizations, it will be that they will not, on May 25th, they will not start a scanner and fine everyone with 20 million euros. But they want to see that you are in the process of getting there. So that's also a thing where I think the GDPR compliance page should be on MediaWiki.org. Mm-hmm.
Would you or someone else be able to give a summary on where Wikimedia Foundation is at with their installation and how they intend to comply? Is that something that's anyone knows?
Yeah,
No, just wait a second. I just want to remind you this is publicly recorded, so be careful about any internals.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you wanted to ask a question? No? Okay. So in the presentation, which is also linked in the fabricator task and in the Etherpad, I put a few links up there, most notably, of course, the text of the law itself, so we can look up for reference. Okay, so check out this Etherpad. As I'm well prepared, I hope. I opened it already. So I guess the best thing we can do in this session is to try and do some kind of collection of where we are and what we can do. Unless there are more questions, sorry. Yes?
One question. So the data collected from a given user, if we anonymize it, after anonymization, is it still considered belonging to that user?
Okay. So that's a copyright thing, basically. Yeah, okay. I have to rely on people that know more about that than I do.
What was the answer, sorry?
It is, yes.
You're talking about like copyright, it then starts to get into like what is copyrightable,
Yeah.
which can vary a lot by jurisdiction, but in some places, like if it's just facts about the user, that may not be copyrightable. In a similar sense to like if you're writing a phone book in many jurisdictions, but not all, the like list of numbers in the phone book isn't copyrightable, but the presentation of it is. I don't think it's related. If you're talking about some other right though, then it's
That could be a
different world.
copyright-related issue if a user requires us to anonymize all the data related to him. Everything he has published is no longer attached to his name.
Oh, no, I wasn't thinking about the content I had created.
Yeah, that's an issue.
Yeah, there's the attribution issue, which is a whole other thing we haven't talked about.
Yeah, but just taking on common sense, if a user requests his removal of his name from Wikipedia and at the same time requests attribution, then the user's probably schizophrenic.
But there may be, in France, you cannot renounce attribution.
Mm-hmm.
It's by law. It's part of moral rights that you cannot renounce.
Yeah, okay,
So,
okay. That might be a legal loophole for any MediaWiki, published MediaWiki stuff, but again, that is up to lawyers to decide, I think. And I don't know about the situation in Germany, for example. Yeah, so, okay, so, what else? Any more questions need for clarification? Okay, so let's assume, let's continue this under the assumption that we will be required to remove personal data, and don't draw this one card. So what kind of data do you think that list is complete? What the data we are collecting actually? So username, real name, email address, language, IP address as like personal, directly related personal data. Yeah, I see the extensions. That is probably also a very vast range of things. So I was thinking about that extension problematic before I did this talk. I think we need to split it up basically and say, okay, this is MediaWiki core, and then see what the situation for extensions is in a second step, because an extension can do almost anything, right? So I know we have social profile extension which stores like any data. We do have extensions that store in wiki pages, so revised. We have extensions that don't store revised, and more. Okay, yeah, web server access logs. That is also a good point. I think it's not in the scope of MediaWiki, like on this GDPR compliance page. It should be mentioned because people should not forget about it, but that just applies to any website yeah, okay. How about like special pages? Is there, except for logs and recent changes, do you think there is other, there's the list of most active users, for example. That might be some kind of information, but if the user is, what happens when the user is deleted? You can't delete a user. If the user is merged into this big blob of anonymous users, will this information persist somehow? Probably not. Okay.
The special active usage would persist until the next time the script is.
Mm-hmm. I guess that's okay. So there are some time periods like 30 days. I think that you can argue that's in the law. You can argue reasonable times.
There's a bug right now, actually, where no, not that one. Never mind. I'm thinking of something else.
Well, I mean that's.
There's a bug where the active user's magic word doesn't get updated ever for certain configurations, but the active user special page does. So.
But as we work in a heavily developing environment, we assume that no bug is forever, and.
One thing is right now with images, for the current version of an image, it's impossible to delete what user uploaded that image, like as part of a revision, delete that. And generally, like if you're looking at a page, you have to add a new, like edit the page because you can't delete the top user. That's something to consider in terms of this.
You can't delete which user?
Well, I guess if you're renaming the user, like the user of the most recent revision of a page, like you can't revision delete that.
But if you delete the user, then it will be merged into the massive anonymous user, this special user.
Yeah, I guess.
Then there would be the anonymous user edited page.
It'd be nicer though if, like, you know, it was, instead of showing random anonymous super merged users, showed the users deleted, like what you get when you use the hide user feature in special block.
Alternative would be renaming the user to anonymous and somehow to generate the identifier from which it is no longer possible to reconstruct the original username.
I don't know if that's good enough, because it's still pseudonymous. I don't know. I think in some ways, what this really needs is the hide user feature. with a button that says like, make this permanent.
So you hide the user, but you make...
Like, you know how there's a hide user feature currently?
No.
Okay, it's disabled by default, but well, not really disabled. By default, no user group has permission to do it. But if you give admins the hide user right, then on this block page, there's an extra checkbox to hide this user in all pages.
But hiding
Hide is not enough, so what we need is like that
you have to be
plus an option to like make it not just hidden, but actually gone.
Yeah.
But like I think
yeah.
that feature could be used as like a stepping stone right now to see the things we need to do.
Okay, that's cool. Let's just put it right. Yeah, great. I love Etherpad because you don't have to do anything as a presenter. People in the audience will help you out. There was a question.
Yeah,
Or
a lot of this seems to be based on the presumption we actually are able to verify the person who's requesting a change, whereas that's actually something that wikis generally don't have a strict requirement for logging in, and you've got some sort of authentication mechanism in place. If you don't have those, you've got the person who's chosen a username, it may not even be their username, it could be someone else's username. They're making a request. How do we know that they're the person who's actually making the official correct request on their behalf?
So
it's a standard case for IP users.
yeah,
Yeah, that's a whole new problem with the IP addresses.
I think that is a process question. So if you run your MediaWiki and you allow pseudonymous or anonymous access, and then, as you say, a person using a pseudonym comes and says, please delete this user, you have to make them, it makes sense to make them prove that they are actually the holder of that pseudonym. That is not a technical question though.
It can be a technical problem if you've never actually chosen to keep enough information to be able to verify it.
Yeah.
If you've actually refused that,
Right.
then you're actually not in compliance.
And
The typical way to do that with logged in users, with users who have an actual account, is to make them log into their account and like edit their user page or something like that.
Yeah.
But with IP anonymous users, I have no idea.
Also, if they have lost their credentials, then
Yeah, I've lost my
Well,
credentials, I can't log in.
I hope they've not lost their credentials and want to be deleted simultaneously.
The problem can be I've changed my email provider and I can no longer access the email that it sends.
Yeah.
How can I rescue my account in order to log in order to be able to verify who I am? We often have people in this scenario where they end up having to create a new account. That old account is effectively lost. No one can ever verify it was there. The only person who could doesn't access the email address. But that's if they did set an email address. If they didn't set an email address, then they can't rescue the account. So how do we make sure that we can actually be able to be used to verify an account in order to be able to make a change?
so I came across this discussion several times here, and I think that is, you have two conflicting interests here. So I don't think there is a blueprint solution for this. So, for example, in order to verify this person, that the pseudonym is still is the person, you might just say restore the IP address as long as the pseudonym is there. That again leads to collection of more data instead of less data. I don't. There is a clause that says you can collect data as long as, or store the data as long as it's necessary to run the operations and services in the way you want to provide them. Where with one exception, eternally is not an option here. Again, that is something that will only be solved in practice. So there will be, I assume that in a few months there would have been some trial cases, and then there will be some rules of thumb for this. Also for the request for takedown of pseudonyms, for example. But let's put it that way from a common sense perspective. If you're not able to prove an identity of a pseudonym, it's probably not possible. So by not being able to prove, you have shown that there is no relation between a person and a pseudonym. That's what I would argue.
I'm sorry, there is a provision in the GDPR where it comments on if it's reasonable to do it. In fact, it says, shall take responsible steps including technical measures. Oh, I'm sorry. Taking account of availability of available technology and the cost of implementation, shall take reasonable steps. And that's directly from it. So there may be conditions where it's just not going to be possible to do it, right? And that's actually mentioned in here in the erasure clause.
Yeah. And we have this reasonable costs, and that's everywhere in this law. So that's what I say. The law is very vague, and I think a good first step is to just address it and say, okay, it's not reasonable. Even for Wikipedia, I would say if like it takes a year to implement, then it's probably not reasonable, and we have to find other ways to get around it. Same thing applies for MediaWiki. So user deletion, for example, is not easy now because you just can't you can go to the database and delete the user, but it's not a good idea. But there is a user merge plugin. So that is a remedy, that's a workaround. You can say, okay, we don't delete that user, but we merged it into the anonymous pool user. And then we have probably come around this rightful erasure, or we have sufficed the requirement. Sorry?
Just talking about future implementation, as it happened by the judges, there has been a lot of discussion about the WHOIS database and whether or not they can just ignore all of this and they're going to be fine. And it's probably a comparable case with large non-profit wikis because it's a public good. They are a rich public good, which is a bit different, but I suppose MediaWiki could be considered to have a fairly good benefactor that could actually implement the changes that would require necessary. So it's just saying, well, we're starting to implement changes is probably not going to be enough. At least that seems to be indication from people who wrote the law. They actually say, no, you're supposed to comply on day one. You may get some special consideration if you're not compliant on day one, but they've told who is not acceptable. So that's also a political case. There's a bit more to it than just the WHOIS database, but it's worth using as a litmus test of whether or not being out of compliance is going to be acceptable. So you may know more on that, and I'm just worried about saying you've got 12 months to comply.
No, that's yeah. They said, I mean, what they always say is you had 2 years to comply.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
But now we have a situation we have to deal with it, and I think starting a process is better than not starting a process.
True.
And yeah, so that's what I think. Okay, so responses to require. I move on to the responses because we were talking about right to erasure, anyways. So again, I think right to erasure is like the most, the hardest bit. But if we go to data portability, then I think like exporting the pages could be a good thing. And as I don't know what you think, but it shouldn't be hard to write, for example, for MediaWikis outside of the Wikipedia, to write a export script that dumps a list of user contributions and then compiles it and says, export me these pages. So, according to the law, I think you have 30 days to react to a request of getting all the data. So that is.
Wouldn't we need to provide GIFs as opposed to pages?
Good question. I don't know.
And that's the contribution, and we do track it at that granularity.
And would we need to provide files or file names? I have no idea.
No, it says the data stored about a user should be provided in a commonly used format. so I'm thinking JSON, XML. I'm a developer, so text files.
Does it say that you have to only give them information about their user, or would just a dump of the entire wiki actually?
Yeah, I was.
It's already there.
I was thinking about that.
But do you
and
need to export all pages because it just says about personal information, right? So just giving the
Yeah.
username and the real name should be enough because that's what we know. So it's always the same username, right? I would expect it otherwise it would be another user, isn't it?
I mean, what about if somebody else on a different account writes something about the user, links their talk page, and it's on another page?
Exactly.
There's
And-
probably a need to implement a mechanism to delete content permanently on request if it contains personal information, because right now there is no way to permanently delete an article. It's going to remain in the revision text is going to remain on the servers, and the archive revision log is going to remain on the servers. And if there is sensitive personal data about someone, for example, on a user page, then there needs to be a mechanism to get rid of that. And I think it also applies to file uploads.
And that's the point where it gets really messy, because you can't just retrospectively edit the history. That contradicts the whole philosophy of a wiki. So I think we need to have wiki users in general, and not only MediaWiki. We need to have to get a position on that is legal as well as feasible. I don't have a solution for that, but I think that we're getting to a point where it's only safe to delete all the content of the wiki, because you never know what kind of traces someone left somewhere, or some person wrote about another person somewhere, and you just can't figure that out.
When it comes to the content, on that part, probably the onus is on the user to provide infringing URLs. For example, Google has an RTBF form, and it requires the user to provide a list of URLs which contains their personal information, and these are to be deleted. So probably it's a safe judgment to automatically delete the user pages, for example, but then the onus would be on the user to provide, for example, that this guy put my name on their user page. I think that's a defensible position.
Yeah, maybe.
Ultimately, like you said, the
but still, I mean, reverse editing history is not. I don't think it's an acceptable option. I know this is. I mean, we're not negotiating with GDPR, but maybe. I think that is also kind of a gray area, because it can't be easily retrieved. You cannot search revision pages in a search, for example. So I think there would be this would all become gray area. I'm not a lawyer. I can't say this is what it is.
The dump formats in general would actually be considered to be a commonly used format. We actually do rely on that for the previous GFDL licensed wikis. That was actually a requirement of that law as well, that license, that it was distributed in a commonly acceptable format, and of course wiki dumps and wiki text, neither of which were really common formats at the time, but considered to be good enough because people could actually use tools to interrogate it themselves. So provided we actually do give links. No.
So that's.
But that would be one extra bit. But that's the one more visible part.
Yeah.
You don't want to export all the email addresses.
No. So we wouldn't want to try and add extra stuff to the dumps, but we could use dumps as a way of saying all the information is actually there. There are tools to interrogate it and identify which is yours. So therefore, it's then up to the user to do it if they want to. It's not being hidden. It's not being difficult hidden. Just the tools may not be the most commonly used tools. They're tools that we provide to complement our own dump format. So it's not like we're making it difficult.
And what did you say was the case where that was used to show
GFDL.
The GPL?
GFDL. So that was a requirement. It's also GPL. Any of the new licenses require that you use or you provide the tools that are necessary in order to compile or make it usable. So if you
Okay, so we are getting closely to the end of that session. I wanna, before we continue discussing until it wears out, I want to ask you what you think is a good way to proceed. I assume that if I now would create a page GDPR compliance on MediaWiki and just dump this there, then it would be taken down like 10 seconds afterwards, because that is might have legal implications and whatnot. I kind of think we should continue working on that, maybe in the Etherpad, until we have a version which we think we can safely present. But that's just a suggestion. If someone has a better idea.
I would suggest looking at it from, well, what is the minimal installation that is actually compliant?
Mm-hmm.
What options do you need to have turned off in order to be compliant? So then you can actually publish. This is one way, not the way, but this is one way of having it set up that it is actually compliant. Like, for example, you must have authentication and not allow IP addresses. Rule out all of those and then allow follow-up papers. Well, if you want to have anonymous users contributing, here is how you would go about being compliant. So we get an initial paper on how it can be set up, ignoring what people may have as their current setup and how they might transition, so that we can one setup that will work and we can fairly safely say that this will be a setup that is not going to cause problems. May not have many people who can actually switch to that very quickly, but at least it's then a starting point of one setup that will work.
Sure, that's a good approach. But again, if we start creating this article publicly on MediaWiki, it has a very high visibility because a lot of people will look for it. So maybe it's just a good idea to do GDPR page and then go to discussion page and work on this, or use the Etherpad, or I don't know.
Can't you just put a big fat disclaimer on top?
Work in
My
progress.
recommendation would be to stick with the Etherpad for now.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Until we have like a good feeling about it. Now we can also always, okay, good. I think, as I said, this is more the kickoff of a process than the end. For anyone who's interested, please contribute to that page. If you want, you can leave me your email address or whatever, and I will put it somewhere publicly and erase it upon request. No, I think that the Etherpad is good for now, and then once we feel like that is a good thing, maybe it's a good idea to put your contact, some way to contact you on the Etherpad, so we can do some kind of informal working group. Assess when we think that page quality is good enough to put it on MediaWiki.org. Okay, thanks for your contribution and for all the discussion, and it's up for the next person to talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.